In the heart of Buckingham Palace, beneath glittering chandeliers and centuries of silence, one sentence changed everything. It wasn't shouted. It wasn't dramatic. It was whispered, clear, calm, undeniable. And when Catherine spoke, the blood drained from every face in the room. A senior aide collapsed into his chair, another ripped a folder in half without realizing it. Even Prince William couldn't meet her eyes, because what she said didn't just challenge royal tradition. It exposed it. Her voice didn't tremble. Her hands didn't shake. She wasn't asking for permission anymore. She simply said, "I won't lie for him anymore." And in just 8 words, the illusion of a perfect monarchy cracked down the middle. What terrifying truth was she hiding? What was behind the palace's deepest cover-up? And why has the future of the royal family never been more uncertain? The walls of the chamber had heard their share of secrets, warnings whispered behind gloved hands, alliances forged in silences longer than words could bear. But on that morning, when Catherine finally spoke, it wasn't an echo of the past. It was the breaking point. The air in the room changed instantly. Not a gust, not a sound, just stillness, heavy, absolute, like the palace itself was holding its breath. She was standing just behind the gilded chair reserved for her during private council sessions. Her expression gave nothing away. Not fury, not panic, just clarity. She wasn't making a request, she was delivering a truth. And no one, not even the future king, had the strength to meet her gaze. William's knuckles clenched against the carved table edge. He looked frozen, like he hadn't taken a breath since the words left her mouth. His usual composure, the kind that had carried him through global ceremonies and royal tragedies, was gone. His eyes didn't flicker to hers. He stayed locked in place, hands trembling slightly, chest still. Across the room, a high-ranking aide, a man known for his calm during Queen Elizabeth's funeral, sat down without speaking, pale as chalk. Next to him, another figure gripped a folder so tightly the edges buckled under his fingers. No one dared break the silence, because no one knew what to say. The ornate grandfather clock in the corner kept ticking, louder now in the suffocating quiet. It sounded almost like a countdown, not towards a coronation, but towards collapse. Eyes darted, no one daring to speak the first word. Even Camilla, who was rarely caught off guard, sat completely still, her teacup untouched in front of her, her hand twitching, like she was trying not to react. And at the center of it all stood Catherine, the beloved Duchess. The mother. The woman once called England's Rose by those who had longed for a new face of the monarchy. But in that moment, petals had nothing to do with it. She wasn't soft. She wasn't delicate. She was done pretending. For months, maybe even years, there had been a quiet rift behind the palace walls, meetings that ended in silence, late-night discussions that fell into arguments, whispers that Catherine had grown, distant, but no one could have expected this. Few believed she'd go so far until she said those 8 words. It wasn't what she said, at least not only that, it was how she said them. Calm, simple, no apology, no hesitation. There was no emotion behind it at all, and that somehow made it even more terrifying. As if the decision hadn't come from outrage, but from resolve. "I won't lie for him anymore." There were no names listed, no accusations screamed, but in that room, everyone knew exactly who and what she meant. And she didn't repeat herself. She didn't clarify, because she didn't have to. The people sitting around that ancient table, wrapped in centuries-old tradition, already knew the story those words pointed to. They just never expected her to be the one to name it out loud. The message was clear, this wasn't a threat. It was a declaration. The time for hiding, protecting, covering, it was over. And they could feel it. Behind her eyes wasn't anger. It was something colder, sharper. Something you could mistake for grace until it sliced through your illusions like glass. Even the tapestries, woven generations ago to represent unity and power, suddenly looked like a facade. Expensive, beautiful, empty, and there stood William. The man who had grown up preparing to lead, held now in a silence so deafening it nearly outshouted the words themselves. Whatever he was thinking, he kept it buried deep. But something behind his face had fractured. That much was clear. He didn't stand beside her. He didn't speak. He didn't even blink. And in that moment, the entire room realized something they had long tried to ignore. This wasn't just a personal matter. This wasn't a disagreement between husband and wife. This was the beginning of something far more dangerous, because Catherine wasn't stepping down. She was stepping forward. And the truth she had just cracked open, it wasn't going to stay buried anymore. What most people didn't know was that Catherine had stayed silent for years, not because she was weak, but because she thought protecting the institution meant protecting her family. She believed that behind the procedures and pageantry, someone would eventually take her seriously. that someone would step in. But no one did. It began quietly. Barely a shift at first. Just little things only a mother would notice. Certain glances from Prince Louis that didn't last long enough. Moments where his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. The way he'd pull his hand away a little faster when he used to cling. Small hesitations. Big silences. The kind most people would miss. She raised it gently at first. During morning walks through the palace gardens, over shared tea in the family wing, inside conversations with William after dinner. A gentle worry, a mother's intuition. But in the palace, an institution built on controlling the uncontrollable, even the quietest concerns were treated like threats. At first, they reassured her. They nodded, offered vague words of comfort. Children develop at different paces. It's nothing out of the ordinary. Everything is under control. But Catherine felt it growing inside her, the unsettling conviction that something wasn't right, that something was being hidden from her. Or worse, that what she feared was being allowed. Specialists started appearing. Not from within the royal family's well-known medical connections, these names weren't familiar. They arrived quietly, avoiding press, slipping through side entrances. These weren't traditional pediatricians. They were hand-picked experts flown in from abroad. Their resumes were impressive but remarkably inaccessible. Their methods, shrouded in confidentiality. Catherine was given summaries of their findings, never full reports. Only high-level overviews, framed as updates meant to reassure her. But what kind of mother only gets summaries about her child's well-being? She asked for more, she was denied more. The meetings were never scheduled with her in mind. William went instead, or sometimes only the advisors. Her opinions were sidelined under the guise of tradition. And as weeks turned into months, her son's behavior became harder to ignore. He was quieter, obedient in a way that felt unnatural. He stopped asking the kind of questions every child should, curious things like why the sky turns pink at dusk, or why birds fly in circles. Catherine began keeping private notes, pages filled with patterns, reactions, phrases he used that didn't sound like him. Behind the polished palace walls, the tension deepened. Charles believed in protecting the monarchy's privacy at all costs. Internal matters stay internal, he reportedly said during one meeting. Camilla, always calculating, saw Catherine's concerns as emotional interference, with consequences that could upset what she called the balance of power. Even William, the person she should have been able to lean on most, began to retreat. He'd listen, nod, but say very little. And when she pressed harder, when she asked him to demand full access to Louis's medical files, he told her the palace was handling it. That sentence broke something in her. She wasn't asking for secrecy. She was asking for truth. She wasn't trying to tear down the crown. She was trying to protect her son. In the quiet of her private quarters, Catherine began writing letters, handwritten pleas meant for eyes that once claimed to love the family above all else. She wrote to Charles, to William, even to the Royal Medical Board. She signed each letter formally and carefully, polite, poised, the way a future queen is expected to be. Those letters, as it turned out, never reached public view. They were blocked before they could become inconvenient. Classified and buried under what insiders later exposed as a restricted marker known only by code, Project Windsor South. She wasn't referred to by name in those files. Neither was her son. It was all clinical. Designations, references, internal codes. The kind of paperwork designed to remove all emotion, all identity. And that, more than anything, told Catherine the truth. Louis wasn't being protected. He was being processed. Handled like a detail in an agenda, not a child. Still, she stayed composed. For the cameras, for public events. She smiled beside William, held Louis's hand in front of photographers, gave perfect statements to reporters. But behind closed doors, she felt herself unraveling bit by bit. And as the performances grew more flawless, the reality behind them became harder to ignore. The Crown had made one fatal mistake. They assumed she would keep prioritizing their silence over her son's voice. But Catherine wasn't just raising a prince anymore. She was preparing for a war she never wanted, but one that had already started. It was around this time that a new name started surfacing, quietly, inconsistently, only ever spoken behind closed doors and never with a title. Not doctor. Not sir. Just a single letter. Mr. E officially, he didn't exist in any public-facing role within the royal household. He wasn't listed in staff directories, wasn't photographed beside aides, and had no known affiliation with the traditional advisory boards. On paper, he wasn't there. But behind the gilded curtains of the palace, he was very much present. He had access to the private royal residences. He worked closely with Prince Louis. Staff were told he was part of a behavioral development initiative, something new, forward-thinking, which in royal circles is usually code for, don't ask questions. Catherine hadn't personally approved him. No sit-down, no background check, no face-to-face. He simply appeared, slipped in through layers of bureaucracy, brought in under recommendation by unnamed international allies. Camilla later defended him, claiming his methods were being used by multiple high-profile families abroad, and Charles, ever the traditionalist, endorsed the plan as progress cloaked in privacy. But from the start, something felt wrong. His real name was never used. Neither by staff nor insiders. He was only ever Mr. E, a title that felt more like fiction than fact. Catherine became suspicious when Louis began using peculiar phrases after his sessions. He stopped asking about people. He started asking questions about himself, questions no child should be burdened with. One day he asked her flatly, "Am I a problem when I don't smile?" And then came the phrase that made her freeze. He told her about the man who fixes mistakes. That was how he described Mr. E. Catherine's blood ran cold. It was too clinical, too rehearsed. Something about it clung to her long after he'd gone to bed. She began probing discreetly, leaning on contacts from her charity work and former private health consultants, the ones who weren't tied to royal approval. And what she found confirmed her worst fears. Mr. E had past affiliations with organizations that specialized not in therapy, but in conditioning. Some even bordered on the extreme. Institutions abroad criticized for invasive psychological techniques, programs that often promised fast behavioral correction, and were accused of suppressing emotional autonomy in children. His resume was curated, full of buzzwords like cognitive resilience and executive retraining. But the deeper she dug, the more glaring the red flags became. Clinical networks he once worked with had been reviewed for silencing parents who questioned methods. Testimonials vanished. Confidentiality clauses were enforced with unusual aggression. In some cases, legal threats had been issued if families spoke out. Catherine didn't need a diagnosis to understand what this meant. They hadn't brought in a therapist. They'd brought in a handler. She confronted palace advisors during a private meeting. She listed everything she'd uncovered, demanded answers. And yet again, she was met with condescension packaged as calm. "He's helped children just like Louis all over the world," they said. "This is for his future." Another advisor assured her that Louis was responding well. When she asked for documentation of those results, there was none, just verbal affirmations. And then she started noticing the changes firsthand. Louis, once so curious and expressive, became subdued. Quiet, immediate to obey, unnaturally cautious. He'd ask for permission to speak at home, something no one had taught him. He flinched once when she raised her voice, not out of anger, but protecting another child from running too close to a flower display. That tiny jolt, that sudden fear in his eyes, didn't belong to the boy she'd raised. But what truly broke Catherine was the last thing Louis ever said about Mr. E. It was after another session behind closed doors. Louis sat quietly, a toy clutched in his hand. And he looked up and said softly, "He said I'm not supposed to feel scared anymore. Scared makes you messy." Catherine couldn't move, couldn't speak, because she knew then that this wasn't about therapy. It wasn't about helping him at all. They were trying to edit her son from the inside out. She demanded his immediate dismissal. Camilla refused. The discussion turned icy. Camilla accused her of being too close to the situation. Charles told her decisions like these needed to be made without emotion. And William, silent again, offered no support, no protection, no protest. Catherine left the room that day knowing something irreversible had taken place. Her instincts utterly clear, her role painfully clear. If she wanted to save her son, she'd have to stand against the palace itself. It was supposed to be just another carefully choreographed evening. A royal family gathering, complete with polished silverware, strategic photo opportunities, and smiling faces that looked beautiful from a distance and hollow up close. Catherine hadn't wanted Louis there, not after everything. Not with Mr. E still in the picture, but the advisors insisted. "He needs to be visible," they said. "The public wants to see him." So she gave in for appearances, for protocol. She didn't know then that it was about to be the night that changed everything. The early part of the evening passed like any other, hollow laughter echoing through the palace halls, aides moving like ghosts just beyond the frame, small talk wrapped in tradition and tension. Catherine smiled on cue, but her nerves were raw. Her senses sharp. Her eyes never strayed far from where Louis was supposed to be, and then he vanished. Only for a few minutes, but long enough to matter. He appeared again at the edge of the long corridor, barefoot, eyes wide, and glimmering with something Catherine hadn't seen before. Not just fear, something deeper. A quiet devastation that didn't belong in a child's expression. He was holding two things. In one hand, a paper crown torn along the middle, its edges curled like something discarded. In the other, a small toy sword, snapped cleanly in half. It was theatrical, almost symbolic, but it wasn't staged. Catherine was already moving toward him when he finally spoke. "They said I'm not allowed to be real anymore." Not allowed to be real. The words hung in the air like frost. No one in the room made a sound. At first, they thought it was a joke, a line from a children's game, a misunderstood sentence. But Catherine knew better. The phrase was too precise, too deliberate. Like it had been placed there carefully. Taut. She knelt in front of him, smoothed his hair back, cradled his cheek in her palm, and that's when she saw it. A slight bruise along his wrist, faint but fresh. A thin scratch just under his eye, nothing dramatic enough to cause alarm on paper, but enough to rip through a mother's sense of safety. She didn't ask him what happened. She didn't have to. He leaned in closer and whispered, "He said not to tell you." The words gutted her. No explanations followed. No details, just silence, dense and suffocating, like the air itself had gone heavy with secrets. In a room full of royals, no one moved. No one asked questions, because deep down, they already knew the answer. They knew what corridor he had walked from, who he'd been with, and no one said a word. Catherine demanded the palace security footage. She didn't make a request, she made a command. What she received hours later was an insult dressed as protocol. A single, polished security clip from the corridor. No entrance, no exit, no audio, the entire file scrubbed clean. No timestamp, no trace of Louis, just an empty hallway. A technical malfunction, they claimed, an error in the archive. But Catherine had spent too many years behind the curtain to believe in accidents. This wasn't incompetence. This was a cover-up. She confronted Camilla first, right there in front of everyone. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. It was weighted with something more dangerous than rage, clarity. "This is not protection," she said, measured and cold. "This is betrayal." Camilla scoffed, rolled her eyes, and turned away. But the room had shifted. Even William looked stunned, like the ground beneath his feet had tilted just enough to throw off his balance. And for the first time, some of the aides looked unsure, like maybe, just maybe, they weren't on the side they thought they were anymore. Because Catherine wasn't hysterical. She wasn't crumbling. She wasn't politicking. She was a mother, one who had finally seen behind the last curtain. You can silence a wife. You can silence a princess. But you can't silence a mother who's looking her son in the eyes and seeing the damage they promised her wasn't real. That night didn't just end with quiet discussions behind closed doors. It ended with a decision. Catherine wasn't going to wait politely anymore. Because what she thought had been a system of tradition was starting to feel like a machine built to erase anyone who dared to resist it. And now it wasn't just resisting, it was personal. It was war. After that night, something in Catherine shifted. She no longer cared about playing the part. The palace could keep their photo ops, their photo-shopped family portraits, and carefully rehearsed appearances. The masks were off. She wasn't shouting anymore, and she wasn't asking for help. She was planning. From the outside, she still smiled, still waved alongside William, still fulfilled her duties with immaculate grace. But behind the palace walls, Catherine began doing something the royals never expected. She started documenting. She built her case in silence. Every suppressed concern, every unanswered question, every deflection she had endured, she began gathering it like kindling. Quietly, deliberately, emails, session notes, security logs. Witness accounts from staff members who had seen and heard more than they were supposed to. People who had been too afraid to speak, now willing to whisper the truth to the one person who still seemed to care. And then came the most damning discovery. A string of internal emails between senior palace aides discussing how to contain her. That was the exact word they used. Not collaborate, not support, contain. One email in particular hit her like a sledgehammer. "If she speaks, we lose control of the Windsor narrative." There it was, in black and white. The monarchy wasn't trying to fix what was wrong. They were managing optics. Catherine wasn't a partner. She was a threat. An inconvenience dressed in royal silk. What happened next only confirmed it. Late one night, while retrieving Louis's medical summaries from her private records, she discovered a sealed folder buried beneath several stacks of documentation. It wasn't marked with a royal seal. No familiar signature. Just a plain header with chilling clarity, "Provisional relocation Prince Louis of Cambridge." She opened it with shaking hands. Inside was a formalized transfer plan. Louis was to be discreetly enrolled in an overseas institution described clinically as a wellness and behavioral optimization program. On paper, it looked polished, sanitized, like a wellness retreat with premium security and access to elite consultants across Europe. But Catherine recognized the name of the facility. She'd seen it in her research on Mr. E tied to accusations of child behavioral restructuring, experimental quiet conditioning, isolation techniques. A place designed not to heal, but to erase. Her breath caught in her throat as she flipped through the pages, appointment timelines, logistical breakdowns, travel dates. But one thing stopped her cold, her signature. It was right there at the bottom of the approval form. Clean, perfect, officially notarized. Only she had never signed it. Her name had been forged. It was a violation so bold it took her a moment to process. They hadn't asked for her consent, they had manufactured it. Catherine, the child's own mother, the princess of the realm, had been legally erased from the most critical decision of her son's life. When she confronted the palace's legal advisors, their faces didn't flinch. No apologies, no denials, just vague dismissals and carefully worded explanations. Documentation error, they said. Clerical confusion. Things that didn't make sense but sounded official enough to stall her. The final nail came with a single-line directive she found tucked inside a Royal Media Division's strategic memo, clearly not meant for her eyes. Ensure public narrative stability, regardless of maternal descent. There it was, an entire institution willing to steamroll a mother just to maintain appearances. Louis wasn't being protected. He wasn't even being considered. He was being moved like a pawn, out of sight, out of mind, off the record. Catherine took the entire file and stormed into William's private residence without knocking. The look on her face must have stunned him. Not angry, not crying, focused. She handed him the paperwork, pointed to her forged signature, to the directive. Asked him one simple question. Did you know? He read it, twice. His face went pale, but he didn't deny it. And when she asked if he would stop it, if he would fight for their son, his answer was a whisper so soaked in fear it barely registered. You know what they'll do to us if this gets out. And that's when Catherine knew. She was standing alone, not just in marriage, not just in motherhood, but in the war to save her child from being erased by the machine she had once sworn loyalty to. Still, she didn't back down. She didn't slow. That night, Catherine summoned her private staff and called for an emergency meeting with every senior aide, every legal representative, every remaining advisor who still held influence over palace operations. And for the first time, without tears, without trembling, she laid it all out. The documents, the forgery, the directives, the lies, she put the truth on the table and watched them squirm under the weight of it. No one interrupted her. No one denied a word, because deep down they all knew the truth. They had helped build the cover-up, and now they were watching it burn. The meeting didn't feel like a discussion. It felt like a trial. No press, no advisors outside the inner circle, no handlers. Just the players who had orchestrated the story for years, and the woman now ready to burn it down. Catherine entered the council room with a leather binder pressed tight to her chest. Her posture wasn't defensive. It was deliberate, like a final move long prepared. She didn't look around. She didn't wait to be acknowledged. She took her place at the long mahogany table, feet planted, hands steady. Charles sat at the head of the room, fingers steepled beneath his mouth, silence wrapped tight across his face. Camilla was already positioned to his right, expression unreadable but eyes sharp. William stood near the window, not a word on his tongue, not a single glance toward his wife. Around them, the ranking aides, the same men and women who had served the throne longer than some citizens had been alive, people who had protected secrets for generations, people who had always believed they could control the narrative. They were about to be proven wrong. Catherine didn't wait for anyone to begin. She unpacked everything in silence, laying each document one by one on the table. The medical forms, the forged paperwork, internal emails, her own handwritten letters sealed and ignored, witness statements, staff testimonies, session notes, the media directive that had tried to erase her voice with 4 chilling words, ensure public narrative stability. Each paper hit the wood like a thunderclap. Still, no one spoke. And then she began to speak, not with outrage, but with finality. Like the verdict had already been written, and today was just about reading it aloud. She walked them through everything with terrifying composure. Louis's behavior changes, the suspicious connections to Mr. E, the exposure of the secret relocation plan, and the forged signature she never gave. No one interrupted her, not because they were being polite, but because there was nothing left to say that wouldn't confirm her every word. William looked pale, not defiant, not supportive, just haunted. a man divided between legacy and the one person his legacy was supposed to protect. When Catherine finally paused, the room felt like it had stopped breathing. You could hear the settle of her folder as she gently closed it. What she said next wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Her voice didn't crack. Her eyes didn't blink. You can silence a title, but not a mother. The silence afterward was the kind that only comes when power itself is shaken. One of the oldest advisors, a man who had served both Elizabeth and Charles, stood up slowly. He didn't look at anyone. He just muttered, "I can't be part of this anymore," and walked out. Seconds later, another followed, dropping a folder onto the table with trembling hands. The slamming sound it made rang out like a gavel. Judgment had already been delivered. Camilla opened her mouth, a slick combination of measured rage and performative disdain curling on her lips, but Charles raised a hand before a word left her tongue. That small gesture stopped her cold. For the first time since Catherine started speaking, the king looked completely shaken, not by what she revealed, but by the one thing he'd always thought he had full control over, the story. But the most devastating reaction didn't come from Charles or Camilla. It came from William. He never said a word. He just stared at her. No rage, no defense, just the look of a man realizing he'd lost something he might never get back, a flicker of regret, respect, or maybe just the realization that he no longer understood the woman standing in front of him or what she was willing to sacrifice. Catherine didn't wait for them to ask her to leave. She turned, gathered the documents, and walked out. Her heels echoed down the corridor, sharp and steady, every step louder than any scandal. But what she didn't know was that someone else had already made their decision too. A recording device, small, hidden, unnoticed, had captured every word. The room, the silence, the sentence. You can silence a title, but not a mother. And within hours, it was public, untraceable, unclaimed, unstoppable. The audio leaked online with no warning. No watermark, just Catherine's trembling, defiant voice cutting through the noise like lightning through stained glass. The internet erupted. Newscasters stopped mid-story. Social media flipped upside down. People replayed it over and over again, as if trying to memorize every syllable of a moment that felt like history in real time. And just like that, the royal family had lost control of the narrative. They weren't just facing uproar. They were facing a reckoning, because this wasn't just a mother who had broken rank. This was a woman who had carried the truth in silence, and finally decided the world deserved to hear it. At first, no one knew where the audio came from. Some said it was leaked by a disillusioned junior aide who couldn't bear the silence anymore. Others believed it had been quietly released by one of Catherine's dwindling inner circle allies, someone who realized that the truth could no longer be buried politely. But in the end, the source didn't matter, because the public heard it. They felt it. And in just under a minute, the story escaped the palace's grip forever. Catherine's voice, calm, clear, unshaken, echoed through headphones, television screens, and news alerts all over the world. You can silence a title, but not a mother. 7 seconds of truth. And 7 seconds was all it took. Within an hour, the internet caught fire. Every major media outlet broke into programming to run the leak. The palace, blindsided, rushed to draft a response, but the damage was already far beyond protocol. It wasn't just Catherine's words that stunned the world. It was what they represented. This wasn't a tabloid scandal. This was rebellion from within the House of Windsor, from the very heart of the modern monarchy. Not whispered by outsiders or lobbyists or press-hungry relatives. Spoken by the future queen herself, publicly, fearlessly. And the internet named her something new, the People's Queen. The trend exploded across social media in less than 2 hours. Royal Reckoning, Protect Louis, Catherine Speaks, and most powerfully, People's Queen. Within days, hundreds of public figures joined in, celebrities, activists, journalists, even political leaders. Not in defense of a scandal, but in solidarity with a mother whose story hit a nerve millions hadn't even known they had. Because beneath the layers of titles, traditions, and golden curtain calls, there was something far more human. A woman fighting for her child. A woman standing against control disguised as duty. And in that, people saw something rare. They saw themselves. The support came like a tidal wave. Protesters gathered outside palace gates with homemade placards. "Not my palace. Break the silence." And most striking, "She spoke, now we will." College students began organizing sit-ins wearing paper crowns, torn just like Louis. Artists created sweeping digital paintings of Catherine holding Louis's hand, surrounded by shadows in royal robes trying to pull him away. It wasn't royal drama anymore. It was revolution painted in elegance. And while the world chose sides, Buckingham Palace stood in total disarray. Days passed, and there was still no statement from King Charles, Camilla, or even William. Every second of silence only made the palace look guiltier. Public trust plummeted. Polls showed more than 70% of younger generations no longer believed the monarchy served the interests of the people. When the statement finally did emerge, it was exactly what no one wanted. In light of recent concerns, the royal household expresses disappointment over the release of private conversations and remains dedicated to preserving the privacy of all family members, especially the young prince. No apology, no accountability, just veiled scolding wrapped in carefully drafted PR language. Commentators called it tone-deaf. Royal historians warned it betrayed the monarchy's greatest asset, restraint. Protesters called it cowardice, and Catherine's supporters, they only grew louder. Inside the palace, the cracks deepened. Advisors began holding emergency sessions behind closed doors, trying to contain the fallout. Reports slipped out about meetings around the line of succession, contingency plans, even whispers of abdication conversations in case of further fallout. One royal insider summed it up bluntly on background. This wasn't just a breach, it was a detonation. And then, quietly and unexpectedly, another voice finally emerged from behind the walls. Princess Anne, the most stoic, loyal, and traditionally minded of them all. She didn't speak publicly, not the way Catherine had, but a trusted journalist quoted her directly in a private message shared upon request. Sometimes loyalty means telling the truth, no matter who it shatters. 5 quiet words. But inside the palace, they sounded like a cannon blast. For those listening closely, it was a signal. Catherine wasn't entirely alone anymore. Even the hardliners were starting to shift. Still, one question haunted every reporter, every supporter, every enemy. What would Catherine do next? Because she hadn't spoken to the press. She hadn't followed up the leak with a public video or emotional address. She didn't have to. One sentence had already made history. But the silence that followed, that's what terrified the palace most. Because they knew if she had released that one recording, she might have more. Just when the palace thought the storm was beginning to pass, something else appeared. Not a video, not a press conference. A sealed envelope. 3, to be exact, delivered simultaneously to 3 international media outlets with one phrase scrawled across the top in Catherine's unmistakable cursive. For the people. Each outlet confirmed that their legal teams had reviewed the contents, but were legally barred from releasing them unless certain conditions were met. The instructions were clear. If Catherine was silenced, discredited, or threatened, the contents would be made public immediately. They called it a measure of protection. The palace called it blackmail. The public called it something else entirely. A mother making sure her voice lived on, even if she disappeared. No one knew what was in the letters, but headlines speculated relentlessly. Unredacted medical records, communications between senior royals, footage, testimonies, proof of everything. Their mere existence was a message, and it came through louder than any interview ever could. You haven't seen everything yet. The royal machine kicked into overdrive. Behind closed doors, the Privy Council reportedly held an emergency session. A leaked internal memo referenced constitutional instability and emergency discussions surrounding succession restructuring. For the first time in recent history, the question wasn't just if the monarchy would survive, but who the monarchy would even be when the dust settled. And Catherine, she made no public appearances. No statements, no interviews, but she didn't need to be loud anymore. The world was already listening. When she was spotted again, it wasn't on a balcony beside William or at a royal engagement. It was at Prince Louis's former school. No press was invited, no photographers. But she stood there for nearly 15 minutes, silent, watching the children play. Some witnesses said she cried. Others said she just stared ahead. But no one said she looked broken. She looked determined. Some claimed she clutched a folder beneath her arm. Others said it was nothing at all. But rumors swirled once again. Was there more to come? Another leak? Another bombshell? Because at this point, it didn't feel like speculation. It felt like countdown. One journalist called it the single most dangerous moment in modern royal history. Not because Catherine was reckless, but because she was precise. Calculated. Everything she had done had followed a path, and they were just realizing it now. She tried to speak quietly. She tried to follow protocol. She waited. She warned. She begged. And now she was done whispering. Because to her, this wasn't politics. It wasn't optics. It wasn't heritage. It was her son. And someone had tried to rewrite his story without her. Not anymore. Inside the royal walls, no one knew what would come next. But the palace no longer held the power of silence, because someone else had already broken it. Catherine hadn't given the world a press campaign. She'd given them a moment that couldn't be unseen, unheard, or forgot. And that final sentence, etched now across protest signs, social threads, and dinner table conversations across the globe, was more than a warning. It was a mirror. You can silence a title, but not a mother. And in the golden halls where power once moved in shadows, that truth now echoed louder than any crown. Because maybe this isn't the end of the monarchy. Maybe it's just the beginning of something else entirely. The walls of tradition are strong, but even they can't stop what happens when truth meets power. If Catherine speaks again, we'll be here. If the palace moves, we'll know. Because this story isn't over, not even close. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss what happens next inside the most powerful and fractured family in the world.